Primite Blue Eyes White Dragon is the newest top tier meta deck, so today I'm going to teach you how to beat it. Thanks to the release of the Blue Eyes White Destiny structure deck, Blue Eyes has become one of the best decks of the format. It's all the way up there with Ryzel, Malice, and any Fiendsmith variant as well. The deck is absolutely incredible and gets even better when you pair it with the Primite engine, which takes advantage of a ton of normal monsters. So if you want to play competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! And you don't know how to beat Primite Blue Eyes, then you're going to want to stick around. Because in this video, I'm going to show you the best cards to use against Primite Blue Eyes, when to use those cards, the choke points and weaknesses against the deck, and even what decks are best suited to beat it. So leave a like on the video if you're excited, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, but with that being said, here is the ultimate guide on how to beat Blue Eyes in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! So the first thing we have to ask ourselves when looking at Primite Blue Eyes is, what does the deck actually want to do? Well, it's not a traditional combo deck that's trying to build an unbreakable board. In reality, it's trying to outadvantage the opponent over the course of a long game, and when looking at competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Over the past couple of months, that's really what the game has become. You're able to build a really solid end board over and over and over again every single turn if it gets interrupted. So what they're trying to do is whittle down all of your resources while being able to create really high impact, low cost end boards that can be recycled over and over again. They have a lot of really good 1-card combos that can be paired together to make some really strong 2-card combos too. On top of that, the combos in general, whether the 1-card combos or the 2-card combos you have, are incredibly layered with their disruption. And that's just what Yu-Gi-Oh! Is nowadays. You have to have multiple pieces of interruption to be able to beat your opponent's board. Gone are the days of having a single copy of Evenly Matched or Dark Ruler No More beat an entire player's end board. You're going to have multiple pieces of interaction to beat a Blue Eyes end board. The main starters in the Blue Eyes deck are going to be Sage with Eyes of Blue, Maiden of White, Wishes for Eyes of Blue, Primite Dragon Ether Barrel, and Primite Lordly Load. These 5 cards you would max out at 3 copies each, so that's 15 starters in the strategy, and they pair extremely well together. They don't really interrupt with one another, and they're able to create a really powerful end board with just 1 or 2 or even 3 of these cards. After that, it's just a few small engine requirements and then a ton of hand traps. Primite Drill Beam is a recurring negate and banish. Mausoleum of White is a part of every combo and gives the deck another normal summon for a level 1 light tuner monster. True Light is one of the most important cards of the deck because it constantly gains advantage and recycles monsters. Roar of the Blue Eye Dragon is an extender, and Majesty is a non-targeting piece of removal. Most Blue Eyes decks are playing 2 copies of the original Blue Eyes White Dragon. However, I have seen some play 3 and I have seen some play 1, but I disagree with both of those. You should be playing 2 copies because you want to get the most amount of benefit from your Majesty, but you also don't want to lose the recurring nature of the Blue Eyes White Dragon. And yes, drawing into one really sucks, but even with that being said, you still have room for like 17 hand traps, and Effect Veiler is one of them, which is a searchable hand trap off of Sage or Wishes. As for the extra deck, it's a toolbox of really good Blue Eyes and Dragon cards. They have the ability to put up a really powerful end board thanks to Crimson Dragon and Cosmic Blazar Dragon or Stardust Cypher Dragon. They have Hieratic Seal of the Heavenly Spheres, they play Line of the Light Charmer, and they also of course have their Spirit with Eyes of Blue, which is the best Link 1 the deck can offer. But now that you know what's going to be in most Blue Eyes decks, what does the end board actually look like? Well, it depends a little bit on what starter you're going to be going with, but the end boards are all extremely layered and really powerful. A single copy of Primite Dragon Ether Barrel or Lordly Load gets the deck a Drill Beam Negate and Banish, with Hieratic Seal's bounce as well, and they're able to do that without playing into Nibiru. Now this may not seem like a lot, but Spheres can get you more follow-up by summoning out any dragon from hand or deck, including Bestial Magnuma, which can search for your Blue Eyes to your hand. As part of the combo, you get a vanilla monster into your graveyard, which means Barrel will add itself back to your hand, and Lordly Load and Drill Beam will constantly get you resources back. Meanwhile, if you have Maiden or Sage and any discard, you can end on True Light with Mausoleum for follow-up, 2 copies of Blue Eyes Spirit Dragon, which can be used to tag into Ultimate Spirit Dragon for an on-field Omni Negate, and Crimson Dragon, which can be used to tag itself into Cosmic Blazar or Stardust Cypher Dragon. Also, there's going to be targeting protection for your Blue Eyes monsters, a searchable Effect Veiler, and of course the negate of graveyard effects offered by Spirit Dragon. If you pair both of these engines together, you get everything I've already mentioned, plus you get a copy of Majesty for a non-target pop 2 instead of Seals. The best part about all of this is that the end board is incredibly strong, but it recycles itself so well. Just think about it. Every time a Blue Eyes White Dragon is summoned, Maiden will summon itself back to your side of the field. True Light constantly gets you additional resources, Ether Barrel will add itself to the hand, and even cards like Primite Drill Beam will set itself as well. And if you have a trap card in your graveyard like True Light, Imperm, or even Majesty, Tyrant Dragon can set it to your side of the field after it battles. But now that you know what the deck looks like and what the game plan is, let's take a look at some specific cards and how they interact against Blue Eyes. starting off with Handtraps, and these are the ones we're going to be covering today. Ash Blossom is not an impactful hand trap against the deck. They can simply link off their level 4 or lower dragon or spellcaster monster that tried to search and get Mausoleum for an extra normal summon and Blue Eyes access. If you did have to ash anything in this deck, I would recommend ashing Wishes since it's a 1 for 2. I would also recommend Lordly Load to shut off an interruption from the Primite engine. Droll is incredible against Blue Eyes. The deck is constantly adding from deck to hand. If they search for a card with Lordly Load, then it turns off their ability to get to Mausoleum, or even get their search with Prayers or Sage. Depending on their starter, they can still end up with a copy of Seals and Handtraps to back it up, which is still quite good, but nowhere near as strong as the full end board. Both Imperm and Veiler are weaker than you'd expect against this deck. All the monsters have two purposes. They can be used to search for cards, but they can also be used to link off into Spirit with Eyes of Blue for another search and more extension. That being said, Imperm is still almost mandatory to play in this format, and Veiler is a bit more deck specific. If you had to Imperm anything, I would recommend using it on Sage with Eyes of Blue to prevent them from getting access to Maiden and therefore True Light, but also using it on something like Primite Dragon Ether Barrel to turn off the Primite engine. Moving on to Nibiru the Primal Being. Nib is a very strong card against the deck because they don't always put up any way to negate it, but some combos are able to play low to the ground and not summon 5 or more times while still being a very threatening end board. And if they do try to extend further, it's usually to get a copy of Spheres, which will let them rebuild even if they are interrupted. That being said, most players nowadays are summoning a copy of Spirit Dragon before they go for their effective True Light. That way if it's destroyed by something like Ghost Ogre, they can protect their end board. And if this does happen, they're going to easily go over the 5 summon limit, which means you can wait until they threaten a copy of Spheres and then drop Nibiru right before they would summon it. So in a perfect world, I would recommend waiting until they have 2 dragons on the field that are not Spirit Dragon, while also using it after they've already used True Light. It's definitely one of the stronger hand traps against Blue Eyes if it resolves. And keep in mind the Nib token doesn't make their Drill Beam live because they have to have a level 5 or higher non-token vanilla monster. Phantasme will almost always be a card you can activate against this deck. They summon Spirit of Blue Eyes every turn 1, but it doesn't actually interrupt the opponent. Sure, the targeting protection is nice, but none of their interruption targets except for Drill Beam. In reality, it's just a budget Mulcharmy Fuwalos. Speaking of Fuwalos, this card is incredible. Dropping Fuwalos will most likely draw you 4 to 5 cards if they play into it. However, a good Blue Eyes player can still play around it without giving out too many draws and still putting up a good end board. Players can summon out Blue Eyes from the graveyard with the Link 1 or even with Lordly Load and then make a Synchro 9 with Majesty access as well. So it ends up being a graveyard negate, an Omni negate on the field, a non-target pop with follow-up and hand traps. That isn't so bad, but that being said, if you have it against Blue Eyes, you would definitely play it, especially when you're going second. As for Perulia though, Blue Eyes is known for normal summoning twice in a turn, so yes, theoretically it can let you go +1 or more, and most of the time they want to normal summon Sage once or twice in a turn. However, they don't usually want to special summon from hand. In my opinion, the other Charmies are just better. Mulcharmy Meows being the newest Mulcharmy is just fine against Blue Eyes. Most combos involve summoning Blue Eyes from graveyard, then summoning Maiden from graveyard too, but it falls into the same issue as Perulia. If you're playing a Mulcharmy, you're trying to draw a ton of cards to break a board or disincentivize your opponent from playing in the first place. Meows doesn't really do that like Fuwalos. If I had to rank the Mulcharmies, I would say Fuwalos is clearly the best one, followed by Perulia, then Meows, closely behind in third place. Shifter is amazing against Blue Eyes. It's arguably the best hand trap against the deck for multiple reasons, but one of the most important ones is that Maiden sends itself to the graveyard for cost, which means they can't even activate it under Shifter. This means no True Light, which limits their access to Wishes and Sage and Blue Eyes too. It also gets rid of so much of their follow-up. They would normally be able to get it back from the graveyard, but it's so much harder to get it back from the banishments. Not every deck can play Dimension Shifter, but if you're playing something like Malice, I would highly recommend considering putting it into your main deck to deal with decks like the Fiendsmith strategies and with Blue Eyes as well. Bystials are already seeing a lot more popularity because the way they can extend in Malice, interrupt cards like the Fiendsmith engine, and even cause problem for Mitsurugi strategies. And Blue Eyes is just another deck that really struggles with Bystials. Using a Bystial on a Blue Eyes White Dragon as they try to revive it is a great hit. Most decks are trying to only play 2 copies of Blue Eyes, and if you can get rid of both of them, you should win the duel. Just keep in mind that Roar of the Blue-Eyed Dragon can summon from the banishment, but that's the only card that can actually summon from banishment in the entire deck. Other great targets to hit with Bystials are going to be Maiden of White, so you can stop it from recurring itself back and getting access to a level 1 tuner. On top of that, you can always banish the Neo Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon if your deck does a lot of targeting, so that way you get rid of one of their interruptions. Just keep this in mind when it comes to the Bestials, specifically with Baldrake and the Druid's Worm. Druid's Worm can be negated by Spirit Dragon because it activates in the graveyard and can be even negated in the damage step. And both the Druid's Worm and Baldrake can be negated by the Neo Ultimate Dragon in the graveyard. And this goes for all Bestials in general, but if they summon the new level 12 Synchro monster, it prevents you from banishing cards from their graveyard. Ghost Spell is below average because it doesn't have high enough impact. It can be used to negate the summon from True Light, Spirit, or Lordly Load, but that's really it. There are always going to be better options against this deck. Ghost Ogre has one amazing target, one good target, and one solid target. If you can destroy the Mausoleum as they attempt to dump a Blue Eyes to the graveyard, they lose it for the rest of the duel, which is really solid. If you destroy the Lordly Load as they try to summon a Blue Eyes from deck or graveyard, it can ruin their combos, but it doesn't stop the most important effect, which is to search for a card. So it's not the best or the worst to destroy the copy of Lordly Load. However, it is amazing if you can use it on True Light. Not only do you cut off their access to set or special summon, but you also are forcing them to destroy all monsters they control. Here's the thing though, Ogre is objectively good against the deck. However, it's just not good enough this format to see play. I'd rather play more Bestials than Ghost Ogre because they have wider application, but in a pinch, Ghost Ogre is a good choice. Dominus Impulse is always a good card, but not every deck can play it. Realistically, you would save Impulse for when they try to special summon Blue Eyes, because if they can't get to Blue Eyes, they can't Synchro Summon and it's much harder to get to Spheres. If your deck can play Impulse, I would always recommend it, but it's not some card that's mandatory to play against Blue Eyes. And Dominus Purge is just another copy of Ash Blossom, but worse. Ash is already just okay against Blue Eyes, so I don't think you have to worry about playing it. But Purge is just a good generic card against so many decks that Blue Eyes itself will be playing it a lot, so just keep that in mind. My top 5 hand traps against Blue Eyes are Dimension Shifter, Molcharmi Fuwalas, Droll and Lockbird, Any Bestial, and Nibiru. Hand traps are great against Blue Eyes and decks are playing a ton of them because they're good going first and going second. But what if you're going to be going second? How good are board breakers against Blue Eyes? These are the ones we're going to be talking about today. Evenly Matched isn't a terrible card against the deck if you were able to interrupt them earlier. For example, if they can't get to Drill Beam, Spheres, Ultimate Sphere Dragon, or Blazar Dragon, Evenly goes really hard because it can get rid of True Light and Mausoleum forever. But that's if you were able to stop them from getting there, which means you have to have other cards to interrupt them. In my mind, Evenly is just a bit too difficult to resolve well enough against Blue Eyes, so I would recommend other board breakers. Dark Ruler No More is not a bad card against Blue Eyes. Like negating the Crimson Dragon or the cards to summon off of it is great, and negating Seals' non-target bounce and even negating Spear Dragon is really strong. But the issue is that Blue Eyes can layer their interruptions. It's not just monsters, it's Majesty, Hand Traps, and Drill Beam 2, which, oh by the way, can negate Dark Ruler. So again, there are better board breakers to consider. Cards that tribute over monsters like Lava Golem, Sphere Mode, and Kaijus aren't bad at all, but that's similar to what I've been saying about all the other board breakers so far. They just don't do enough. I would highly recommend stopping them with hand traps first before relying on tributing cards like Kaijus and Lava Golem. Kashtira Fenrir is very strong. It's a card they have to address right away because if they don't, they can lose cards like True Light or Mausoleum forever. However, I do think it's better when you're going first rather than when you're going second, which does open up a few other problems because Blue Eyes can just beat over Fenrir. Change of Heart is useless. It targets so Neo Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon can negate it. They can always tag out of a Spear Dragon or Crimson Dragon, and Spheres can also just tribute itself to dodge. Do not play Change of Heart for Blue Eyes. Triple Tactic Talents on the other hand is a very strong card because it doesn't target. I already think highly of Talents in this format and believe most decks should be maining it. Even if they tag out of a card, you can always just steal something else. But your opponent has to have activated a monster effect during the main phase, which isn't always going to happen. And when they do, they'll usually have Ultimate Spear Dragon or Blazar Dragon as a negate. And that's not even considering the Drill Beam negate. But if they don't have any of those, then you're in business, especially in the mirror match. Forbidden Droplet is a really interesting card in this matchup. It's very hard to use effectively in response to a card like Spirit Dragon or Spheres because they tribute for cost. However, it's great against the Crimson Dragon play. But here's the problem. The full Blue Eyes Primite endboard has True Light, Drill Beam, and monsters on the field. If you don't send at least one monster, spell, and trap, Droplet can be played around. For example, say you send a monster and a trap card, your opponent can activate Drill Beam to negate it. Now if you send a monster and a spell, they can chain True Light, then chain Drill Beam to negate. If you send a spell and a trap, they can just use Spirit to tag out and then Drill Beam once again to negate it. Basically, against the full endboard, if they have Drill Beam up, then you're never going to be able to resolve Droplet as well as you wanted to. Board wipes like Raigeki, Dark Hole, Lightning Storm, and Harpy's Feather Duster just aren't strong enough. They can easily rebuild their board because they have a ton of ways to recycle almost anything from the graveyard. They could also just negate the board breaker, but when paired with multiple different board breakers, that's when it becomes really good. Cosmic Cyclone is great against exactly True Light, and that's it. But just keep in mind that True Light isn't like Fire King Island. It won't destroy their board if it's banished, only if it's sent from field to graveyard. Overall, I would say that Handtraps are better than board breakers against Blue Eyes because it's so much easier to stop them from getting to interruption than it is to play around negates. But there are a ton of cards I didn't cover in this past section. I'm going to cover them right now. Cards that are going to be good going first, going second, and even cards that are going to be good when it's your turn 0. On your turn 0, I would recommend a card like Ally of Justice Cycle Reader. This is a very specific and niche card that does have a lot of impact. It's essentially going to be a double bestial for light monsters. So you can always use it to get rid of a copy of Blue Eyes White Dragon and a copy of Maiden, for example, which can have a lot of application, and because it doesn't summon the monster to the field, it doesn't make Triple Tactic Thrust quite as good. As for when you're going first, I would recommend Deck Lockdown, which is a phenomenal card against this strategy. It makes it really hard for them to search for a copy of Mausoleum, but also for a bunch of level 1 light tuners, which is what makes the deck go. On top of that, they have 5 main starters in the strategy, and having Deck Lockdown turns off 3 of them, which is really important. But when you're going second, the best board breaker in my opinion is going to be Super Polymerization. The card is phenomenal because it can't be responded to, but it can also get rid of pretty much any threat the deck has. You can summon out copies of Mud Dragon of the Swamp, even Garura, or you can summon out Chaos Star Source Dragon, which is the tech of the day. This card is phenomenal. It requires a lighter dark dragon monster and another dragon monster, and then it can pop cards on the field up to the number of lighter darks that were used for its fusion summon. This card is how you would shut down basically an entire Blue Eyes board with a single Super Poly and discard. I also want to shout out MattOshea as a great card for when going first and going second. It's going to be really good to get big bodies onto the field because you have a ton of 3000 attack point monsters or 2500 attack point monsters in Blue Eyes, but you can also just use Effect Veiler as your main piece of interruption on MattOshea, because if your opponent summons a copy of Maiden or Sage, for example, you can always use MattOshea to negate that card and summon out a copy of Effect Veiler, which is great. No hand trap or board breaker is perfect against Blue Eyes, but there are a ton of really good options, and when you pair them together, that's how you're going to find the most amount of success against Blue Eyes. Now, some of the choke points and weaknesses of the Blue Eyes deck include obviously True Light. This is like the heart and soul of the deck because it gets you constant access to Blue Eyes from your graveyard or hand, but it also gets you access to Maiden by extension, and it also gets you all of your really powerful Blue Eyes spell and trap cards like Roar, Majesty, and even Wishes for more searches. If you can banish True Light, they have no way of recovering it, which is really, really important. And shockingly, Blue Eyes White Dragon is another big choke point for the strategy. If you can get rid of all their copies of Blue Eyes and banish them, they have no way to get them back except for Roar of the Blue Eyed Dragon, which they usually only play one of. That being said, it's going to be hard to do that, but if you can get it done, you're going to be in a great position to win the game. And finally is the graveyard. The graveyard is so important when it comes to playing Blue Eyes. I already mentioned how good Dimension Shifter is, but if you can get rid of cards like Ether Barrel by a DD Crow, for example, or just get rid of all the really powerful light monsters in the graveyard, they lose all their follow-up, which is really important. Now let's talk about decks that have a good, bad, and average matchup against Blue Eyes. Starting off with a deck that has a good matchup against Blue Eyes, we have Malice. Malice is a tremendous deck against this strategy. Not only because they put up a really strong end board that has a ton of layered interruption, but because they're able to main Dimension Shifter, they can banish all the Blue Eyes monsters from the graveyard, and they can shut down any ways for Blue Eyes to follow up their plays. As for a deck with an average matchup against Blue Eyes, I would say that Blue Eyes has an average matchup against itself. It's a very interesting mirror match and has a lot of really unique plays going on. But one very critical thing that you should focus on if you are playing the mirror match is going to be when to use your copy of Primite Drillbeam. I would almost always recommend using Primite Drillbeam in response to your opponent's Primite Drillbeam to negate it and banish it as well. Because if you can banish their Drillbeam, they lose one piece of interruption, they would just keep recycling back every single turn. But as for a deck with a bad matchup against Blue Eyes, now listen, I don't personally believe any top tier meta deck has a bad matchup against Blue Eyes. Blue Eyes can just out-resource all of them, which is what it's really trying to do. That being said, a copy of Spirit Dragon has a really good time against the decks that play the Fiendsmith engine because you can stop them from getting access to their Light Fiend monsters on the field, but it's not always going to be perfect. But again, I don't think decks that play the Fiendsmith engine are going to be inherently weaker against Blue Eyes than other strategies. I just think it's an engine that's not as powerful against Blue Eyes as it would be against other strategies. Overall, Blue Eyes White Dragon is one of the best decks of the format. It has an argument for being in the top 3 with Malice and Rizal. But overall, the deck itself does have a lot of weaknesses for you to exploit, and because it's going to be an incredibly popular strategy, you have to know how to play against it, so make sure to side accordingly. If you liked the video or you learned something new, then I would really appreciate it if you left a like on the video, and of course subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Check out episode 1 of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Budget Challenge on your screen right now. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time.